to all the participants to the afternoon session of day one of SICON International Online Conference on Love 2022. In the inaugural session presided over by Dr. Lizzie Matthew, Principal of St. Teresa's College, Ernakulam, her address was followed by the journal release and address by the Chief Editor of Singularity's Transdisciplinary Biannual Research Journal, Dr. P.K. Babu, and also the declaration of the theme of race for SICON 2023. Welcoming you all once again back to the two sessions scheduled for this afternoon. Our first session will be run by Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, USA. She'll be speaking on what has the pandemic told us about who loves who in India. Introducing the speaker, Professor Jayati Ghosh, to us today is Ms. Ashwati MP, Assistant Professor, Korimbil Ahmed Haji Memorial Unity Women's College, who will chair the session as well. Ms. Ashwati, Dr. Jayati, welcome both of you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The pandemic has taught us what Arundhati Roy remarked once about love. To love, to be loved. To never forget your insignificance. To never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you. To seek joy in the saddest places. To pursue beauty to its love. To never simplify what is complicated and complicate what is simple. To respect the strength, not power. Above all, to watch, try, and understand. To never look away, never to forget. The ripple effect throughout the economy induced by the unleashing of the pandemic and the resultant lockdown was very huge and impactful. Obviously, the particular context of pandemic produced some new binaries among the old binaries existing in India. One such binary is lovable versus less lovable. The stimulus measures that the country introduced and adopted taught us a lot. There are still more to learn. In fact, we are here to know what has the pandemic told us about who loves whom in India. To discuss this million-dollar question, we have a veteran economist here. She is none other than Professor Jayati Ghosh, who is one among the 20 prominent personalities appointed by United Nations to high-level advisory board that will provide recommendations for UN Secretary General to respond to the current and future socio-economic challenges in post-COVID-19 world. Dr. Ghosh is a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts. She completed MA and MPhil in economics from JNU and joined Cambridge for PhD. She taught economics at JNU for 35 years and authored many books. We are so blessed to have Dr. Jayati as the keynote speaker of the session. I welcome her to the platform of Singularity's International Conference on Love 2022. I also welcome Dr. P.K. Babu, Dr. Elizabeth, Dr. Jisha John, Ms. Reena, Ms. Vinita, Dr. Sonia Thomas, and the delegates to the session. Now let me invite Dr. Jayati Ghosh for the keynote address. Ma'am, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ashwati. Thank you, Reena, and everyone who has invited me. It's such a pleasure to be at such a different kind of conference, which is looking at such important and complicated issues from an interdisciplinary perspective. It's definitely both a pleasure and a challenge. So thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. I have to confess, when I first heard about the theme of this conference, I was a little thrown. Because, you know, economists, we are not used to talking about love. We are used to talking about material conditions, about economic processes, about things that appear objective in their reality, although we know that many of the things that appear objective come from very subjective interpretations of facts. But I'm really happy that this forced me to think a little bit more deeply about what I would know of love and what it has taught, certainly me, and I think many of us, what the pandemic has taught many of us about what's going on in India and the nature of it in terms of how it pans out for our society and our future. So, of course, the first big $1 million question, what is it? What is love? And Ashwati had a wonderful quote from Arundhati Roy, which described it in the best possible way, in a very expansive, human, forgiving way. I didn't actually think back to Arundhati's definition, but I thought of two other definitions that have resonated with me over the years. The one is from Theodor Adorno. He is the German philosopher of the Frankfurt School of the mid-20th century. And he had, in his aphorisms, he had this wonderful phrase, love you will find where you can show weakness without provoking strength. Now, you can show weakness without provoking strength. I think he used this really to refer to interpersonal relations, but we can expand that to think of class relations, to think of relations across different groups of people, to think of relations between men and women generally in society. It's quite a different and, to me, interesting way of thinking about love, that you can expose yourself with all your blemishes and blunders and not have to worry about it, or that you can be the weaker party without having the strength of the other one forced on you. So that's one definition I want you to bear in mind for the rest of this talk. And the other is from someone whom I can't actually remember where I read it, but also it resonated with me. Love is the inability to look away, no matter how difficult it is to keep looking. And I think that too is something which is very real. We in India, we're very used to looking away because there's so much to look away from, which is distressing or terrible or shocking or unhappy making. The inability to look away, the inability to keep looking, to go through that pain, to empathize in a way, is also, I think, a good expression of love. Okay, so now we've got these two definitions, which are obviously not all encompassing, but for the purpose of this lecture, let me just hold on to these two. Where you can show weakness without provoking strength of the other, and where you will not be able to look away, all right? Using that, what do we know then? What has the pandemic taught us about love? And I thought about this, and oh my God, there are 6 very bad things it has taught us, okay? So let me begin with the bad news first, and I have to spend time on that because unfortunately that is so much of our reality today. So forgive me if it's going to be depressing, but that is the nature of the reality we face. What have we learned? First of all, that there's very little of it. There's very little love in India, in terms of the fact that those who show weakness pretty much provoke strength, pretty much have strength thrust upon them and are exploited for their weaknesses, and that others have a fantastic ability to look away when that weakness is being exploited or when they are being, abused in many different ways. There's so many examples of this, right? I mean, the most graphic example was, of course, the terrible, terrible long march of the migrants during the peak of the lockdown in May, June 2020, which actually continued into July and August as well, where workers who were denied livelihood overnight for no fault of their own, not given adequate compensation, not given wages, not given even enough food, had no options but to try and get home in whatever fashion they could. In a period when they could not access public transport, they were forced to walk on roads where they were beaten, they were sprayed with dangerous chemicals as disinfectant. I mean, all kinds of nonsense was perpetrated on them, on the weak, by those who could, who felt relatively strong, if you like. And of course, the rest of the country pretty much allowed it to happen. There wasn't the kind of immense public outcry that you would think such inhuman treatment of our fellow beings would generate. There was more or less acceptance of this. Another example, the food shortages. Dramatic increase in the reduced access to food. Now, I realize that many of you are in Kerala where you did not experience this to the same extent. You are lucky enough to live in a state which had a much more compassionate response, a much more equitable response, a much more socially inclusive response than most other states in the country, and certainly than the central government. But Nonetheless, in most parts of the country, it's not just the migrant workers, but it was people in general who faced huge food shortages, who faced immense problems in actually meeting basic needs of their families. And this in turn is something that was accepted by those who didn't have to actually worry about food. Yeah, so we have the ability to look away. The collapse in livelihoods. I can think of no other country where we had such a dramatic, sharp lockdown. You know, the Indian lockdown was seen as the most stringent in the world. It got 100 out of 100 in the Oxford Index for stringency, right? We were out there in the top. And that really stringent lockdown, which was treated like a military curfew, you know, where people were being attacked for being on the street or coming out even for anything without being any questions asked. That stringent lockdown in a country where 97% of workers are informal, they don't have legal protection, they don't get social protection, just meant a massive collapse in workers' incomes and livelihoods. Half of our workers are self-employed. Of course, they were wiped out, other than those who happen to be in agriculture. And the rest who work for small or enterprises, 85% of them work for small enterprises, again, faced huge problems. Most of them were denied wages. We know that the middle class behaved in the same way, denying domestic workers their wages over periods of lockdown when they were forbidden from coming into homes, and many, many other such examples. So, yeah, there's very little love. That's the first sad conclusion. The second conclusion is that what little love there is very unequally distributed. In other words, we tend to love our families, maybe our extended families, and those in whichever perceived identity group that we want to belong to. Sometimes it's our little local community, you know, our housing society. Sometimes it's our caste. Sometimes it's our religious group. Sometimes it is our class group. But our love is reserved for those around us and those with whom we can identify very closely. We don't really have much love for others. And the examples here again are endless. I think middle class in India showed this to an extreme degree. I live in the city of Delhi, the national capital region. And there were so many stories of housing societies where the same workers who had been catering to the daily needs of the residents for every day, for years and decades sometimes, were denied admission, treated badly, not allowed to use the public lifts, you know, treated as sources of infection, treated with extreme disrespect and callousness about their own conditions. And this was not necessary, but it showed really that not just the absence of any empathy, but precisely that, you know, the minute you have some strength vis-a-vis someone who is weak, who is going through a bad time, you don't hesitate to use that strength in a way, in the worst possible ways. So many examples of the unequal distribution of this love. The third sad conclusion is that even within our little groups, our little families, our little communities, our little identity groups, our little residents associations, our little class, you know, organizations, even within those, it's very gender differentiated. It's not the same for men and women and boys and girls, this love that people can access. And again, many examples. The pandemic showed a massive increase in violence against women. And this was surprising because, you know, it's also that a lot of it went underreported or unreported because in the pandemic, women were actually stuck at home with the perpetrators of that violence. So they couldn't really come out and protest. They had nowhere to go. They were literally captive in the homes in which the violence was occurring. We know that wherever, you know, men feel insecure for various reasons and they're unable to vent the frustration against those who are causing it, they turn to those who are weaker, those who are around them, where they can get away with that violence. And of course, it's not surprising, therefore, that across the world, there was an increase in violence against women. Men who lost jobs, who lost incomes, who were tense about the future, who were nervous. They're upset, they're nervous, they're angry, and they're ready to erupt at any moment. And all of that you can only exercise on somebody who's forced to accept it, on someone who's weaker than you. which in most patriarchal homes in India, it's the women around you, your wives, your daughters, your sisters, your mothers. And so there was a massive increase in violence against women. But of course, this gender differentiated love didn't just stop at violence against women. It also extended into all kinds of other things. Job losses. You know, India already has the lowest rate of recognized employment of women in the world, down there with Saudi Arabia. India and Saudi Arabia are the two countries with the lowest recognized employment of women. Of course, women are doing lots of unpaid work in the homes, in the communities and all that, but that doesn't get counted, right? And of course, if it's not recognized employment, you don't earn incomes and you don't get rewarded for that. But in the pandemic, even that fell much more than for men. In other words, one of the big sharp shocks was that men's employment fell, but women's employment fell even more. Disproportionately, women lost jobs during the pandemic. There's no earthly reason why. But we have seen this again globally, but especially in India. Women get rationed out of good jobs. When there are a few good jobs available, women tend to get excluded. And when there are few jobs available altogether, then women get rationed out of all jobs. And the pandemic was a classic expression of this, where in fact women were disproportionately thrown out of jobs. We've seen this again in the treatment of girls. Schooling. Now, one of the massive failures of our pandemic strategy has been the way in which we've dealt with children and with education and with schooling and even education of the youth in colleges and universities. It's been disastrous. We just did lockdown and we did nothing else. Then we announced that education will turn online, which is a joke in a country like India, where online doesn't mean anything, where online for at least half the population is something that they cannot access. And to say that you're going to move education online assumes that the children will have access to connectivity, that they will have access to a phone or a tablet or something that will enable them to use that during school hours, and then that they would have access to the learning materials that they will need to keep learning. None of that is true for most of the children in this country. And survey after survey has found this. But of course, the gender implications of this are also quite severe. A lot of the surveys found that where there was, in fact, one smartphone in the house, which is the typical case in most families, it would be the boy child who gets it for the classes, not the girl child. Disproportionately, girls simply dropped out of any attempt at education. They just, families stopped bothering with it altogether for girls. Whereas they kept making efforts for boys. They would perhaps even set up private tutoring and things like that for boys. So another example of, if you like, the unequal distribution of love in gender terms, even within families. And of course, many other ways in which this love that we have or have very little of, it's not just unequal, but where you have it, you still have a bigger share of it for male rather than female, which is another aspect. Another thing we rarely talk about in India, but the transgender aspects are also very important here. The kinds of exclusion that transgender people have been through in this pandemic are also quite remarkable and definitely an indication of how much, if you like, gender prejudices and gender discrimination accounts for this unequal distribution of love. Okay, I'm sorry, this is all sounding really heavy, but it's getting worse. I'm warning you, there are two more bad news to reveal. 3. The fourth piece of bad news about love in India is that the government actually shows very little love for the people. I'm thinking now especially of the central government, because I think across state governments it was very, very different. It varied massively. And as I would like to point out, those of you who are in Kerala were lucky that there was a very different response than in many other states. And so it was very differentiated across states. But the central government showed remarkably little love for its people. Why do I say that? Not in terms of what it said, but what it did. And we find that the Indian relief package, the central government relief package, was one of the smallest in the world. Now, this comes as a shock to many people who believed the statements, the official stuff coming out. So the first relief package, and then the very big one, which was announced, I forget the name of it now, but the one that was supposed to be 10% of the GDP, 10 lakh crore, a big announcement made in July 2020 by the Prime Minister about this massive Atmanirbhar Bharat Yojana, which was going to give all this additional impetus to the economy. Actually, it didn't involve any additional spending. It was all words. It was all jumla, as they say in North India. And it turns out that most of it was things like, bank guarantees without actual money being spent, or it was promises of tax relief, or it was allowing you to repay your loans later, or allow you to take your own money out of your own provident fund earlier than you would be able to otherwise. All kinds of things that were not relief at all. In terms of actual relief, actual additional spending, you will be shocked to hear this. The Indian government spent less in 2021 than it did the year before. It spent less. Now, compare this to other countries. The advanced countries spent anywhere between 10 to 30% of GDP more than they had spent the previous year. 10 to 30% of GDP more, okay? BRICS countries, other developing countries like us, they all spent between 5 to 10% more in GDP, except India. We spent less. Why did we spend less? Because tax revenues fell, and so the government wanted to be fiscally disciplined. And so it decided that it had to cut down on its spending. So even though it spent a little bit more on the food subsidy, that's about the only relief that was offered in any significant way, and a little bit more on the employment guarantee program, which it had to do because it's a demand-driven program legally. It spent less on other things. It spent less on education. It spent less on sanitation. It spent less on basic amenities. It spent less, believe it or not, this year, the first half of this year, it has spent less on health in a pandemic, in the middle of a health crisis. So the government obviously gets away with showing very little love for its people. And this is something which is kind of remarkable in a democracy, but there it is. Then the fifth depressing fact is that people also expect very little love. In other words, all of the things that I've told you is not news to most people in the country. They don't expect governments to love them. They don't expect much from governments. They are grateful for whatever little they get. They are willing to compromise or just take it as their fate. And just, so whether it is government or it is employers or it is the rich in general, the people in the country are not protesting. They're not protesting that in this period when 99% of the population has been smashed in terms of livelihoods and incomes and things, 1% is doing very, very well. Maybe even 2% is doing rather well. And the richest people in the country, we now have doubled the number of dollar billionaires in India. And the richest people in the country, Mr. Ambani and Mr. Adani, Mr. Adani's wealth has gone up by 5 times in 1 year. Gone up by 5 times, 500%. Mr. Ambani's only went up by 200%. But still, since he began with a higher base, that's not too bad either. So the richest have done really well. They have profited of this pandemic. The poor, as you know, have been devastated. The middle classes also are getting more and more devastated. They are losing incomes. They're losing security, job security. It's continuing, right? The pressures on the middle class continue. And yet, people don't expect anything really. They don't expect love, either from employers or from the rich and the elites, or the poor from the middle classes, or citizens from their governments. It's extraordinary in a democracy, again, to realize that people expect such little love. And the sixth and most depressing of all, sorry, but I did warn you, the most depressing of all is that Another thing we learned over these 2 years is that it's much easier to mobilize people around hate than it is to mobilize them around love. It's very sad, it's frightening, but it's evident. And we cannot kid ourselves any longer. We can't pretend that it's not the case. We can mobilize around religion, which is the current big thing that is being played up to say, you have to hate this other person. We can mobilize around some notion of liberals, westernized liberals, and get everybody to hate them. We can mobilize around caste and get people to hate people from another caste. We can mobilize around hate against women, as we know, as we've seen, for example, on these attacks on Muslim women, on women journalists online. I mean, social media is full of that kind of hate. So it's actually much easier to mobilize people around hate than love. So here are 6 very, very depressing things that we have learned about love in India over the last nearly 2 years now. But this, again, last really depressing point I'm making, but I warn you, it is depressing. If we thought that this is the worst that can befall us, no, this is just the starters, the appetizer course. Climate change is already happening in India. We already have climate refugees. We already have people being displaced by major climate events. We have farmers losing soil productivity because of massive erosion and deforestation and desertification of the land. We have avalanches, we have floods, we have all kinds of things which are only going to intensify these problems. In other words, the pandemic was certainly a challenge, but it was a challenge that we could have come up with, responded to. And many countries really did respond much better than us. Bangladesh responded better than us. Thailand responded much, much better than us. Vietnam, Costa Rica, you name it. Poor, not rich countries. The rich countries, okay. New Zealand, Scotland, you can say they can afford to. But middle-income countries, low-income countries showed much better responses than we did, both in terms of government response and societal responses. So this was a relatively easy challenge, and we didn't live up to it. What will happen when there's a really big challenge? Like climate change will give us really big challenges. And those challenges will necessarily mean localized things. If a flood happens, it happens in a particular area. If there's an avalanche, if there is desertification, these are geographically restricted. If we can show so little love in these situations, how are we going to show love in the tougher ones, in the harder, more difficult, more intractable circumstances? So I think that's the other thing we have to bear in mind. Okay, now all this is very depressing. I accept that. But I'm not completely depressed. If we had to look only at this, then we would all just take to our beds and say there's no point going on living because, it's all so terrible and there is no love and so on and so forth. I think what is remarkable about India is that we've also seen that there is evidence of love, even defined the way that I have mentioned it in the beginning, of people who do not respond to seeing weakness by showing their strength, and of those who do not look away and who keep looking and who keep caring and who keep empathizing. I had a teacher years ago, an English woman, a very famous economist called Joan Robinson. And she used to visit India a lot. And she had one very interesting thing to say about India. She said, everything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. And I think that's right. Okay, so everything I've said so far, it's true. But then the opposite, you can find the opposite. You can find this love. And I'm going to tell you several examples that I have seen. There are some remarkable examples of love, of solidarity, of courage, despite all kinds of odds, despite it being really difficult and really not just challenging, but, people often do this under threat of their own lives, okay? Think of the farmers' movement. which showed such amazing solidarity and love across the country, across different castes, across different religions, across different communities, across regions, across languages. You had a remarkable unity displayed by the farmers' movement. And those who visited the farmers' sites on the outskirts of Delhi came back with such amazing stories of generosity, of solidarity, of care. Before that, I was present at many protest movements, the anti-CAA movements. And again, the same kinds of things. There was so much love, there was so much solidarity, there was so much empathy, there was so much interest in people from different regions, communities, walks of life, occupations, education levels. There was so much sharing. There was so much joy. And there was a lot of joy in these protests as well. I think we have to remember it wasn't just, struggle. There was a lot of communal sharing and joy. And the farmers' movement, of course, is particularly remarkable because it was also successful. Both of these movements were completely peaceful until one was disrupted by riots and then the pandemic. The farmers' movement persisted in being peaceful despite so many provocations, and persisted in remaining united despite so many attempts to divide. And women played such a huge role in that movement. They were so important in being there, in providing different kinds of support, in providing so much music and creativity, and showing that women farmers are farmers and part of all these struggles. So I think it was a very inspiring example of love that spreads across the country and is very, and remember, about 70% of our population has got some link with a farming family. Either your own family, cousin, uncle, brother, father, someone is farming, or you have an ancestral home where you go back all the time. So farming is a very integral part of our social being. And the fact that the farmers' movement could show so much love, I think is a huge example for us. Then there are voluntary organizations who did so much despite, again, so many constraints. Remember, NGOs have been progressively smashed by the central government for the last 5 years. They faced all kinds of difficulties raising funds, getting registration, sometimes being hauled up by enforcement directorate or tax for nothing, just because they have been fighting for the rights of the landless or tribal people or those who are being evicted or displaced and so on. Nonetheless, we found that in this period of crisis, when the government failed, these voluntary organizations, these social movements, they stepped up. And many of them involved young people, which, really is very inspiring. Many students of mine and in other places went and worked in different slum areas in different parts of the country to help and to provide some assistance to those who were really facing the brunt of this livelihood collapse and the public health crisis. So I think that's another example of how there is all kinds of love, despite the impression that there isn't, if you like. Then I think there's another aspect that has emerged, which is, again, very prominent among the young, which is the recognition of new forms of love and new expressions of love, more creative expressions, wider, more inclusive recognition of what constitutes love between genders, within genders, across classes, across communities, across religions, across languages. Among the young, I believe, there is a much greater sense of not just inclusivity, but of tolerance and of willing to risk new things. And also there's a much greater courage, certainly, than my generation has displayed. So I have great hope for the future because I think the challenges are immense, but I do believe the younger generation has shown the intelligence and the courage and even the audacity to cope with these challenges. And that brings me to my final point, which I think is that certainly in India and probably everywhere, the biggest impediment to love is not actually hate, it's fear. I don't think that many of the people who opt for hate are doing this in any conscious, active way. It's an involuntary reflex. It comes out of fear. It comes out of insecurity. It comes out of wanting to be with the powerful. And if we can overcome that fear, then I think we would actually get to a society which delivers love in the way that I defined it at the very beginning. And as I said, I think many of our young people are already showing us the way. I'm really grateful for some of my students. I think they are remarkable and some of the students across the country who've shown such wisdom, actually, and vision and creativity in dealing with all of these incredible challenges. So I think finally there is a future for love in India. So the last sentence for me would be that the pandemic has shown us that there isn't too much love in India, and that it's unequally distributed in all the ways that I've mentioned, but also that there are seeds of a much more inclusive, all-encompassing, and empathetic love, which is what we would need for the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, madam. Thank you very much for that little pieces of things that either as being part of it or not being part of it, we missed out, we got something, but you truly made us look into our own state of affairs from a different point of view. Now, if I would like to summarize what we have been listening to, we started with your two definitions of what is love, and then we moved into your 6 premises on what were your observations during the pandemic, that there is very little love, the unequal distribution of the little love that is available, and then the gender differentiated love, and the little love that government has shown for people, and the people expecting very little and happy, being grateful for whatever little they got. And it's even more painful to hear that it's easier to mobilize people around hatred rather than love. I would say that was the point that made me the most disturbed. And it's, again, hopeful to listen to you that there is a recognition of newer expressions of love, with your final winding up with a note of positivity where you said, fear, overcoming fear might give us a better tomorrow, and your hope in the youth that is acting right now. You reminded me of Maya Angelou's words, fear and hope cannot live together. Anyways, that was a thought-provoking session on who loves who in India. Let me call upon Ms. Ashwati once again to move ahead with the interactive session. We might have a few questions coming up. Ms. Ashwati, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, please take over from here.
Yeah. There is a question from Pradima Agnihotri. How about the aged, most lovelessly treated across all categories? So,
yes, that is such a good question, and absolutely right. I didn't mention it, and I should have. The thing is, there's so many examples of the lack of love in our country, but absolutely true. The treatment of the aged is something that is particularly bad, and I should say in particular of elderly women. We have, of course, everybody knows this, especially in North India, the worst treatment of widows anywhere in the world. But of the elderly in general, there was a survey of the conditions of elderly done, I think, by HelpAge India, which was horrifying in its results in terms of how poor to middle class to rich, there is a real mistreatment of the elderly. So it's not something that is defined only by material conditions or by insecurity. It's defined by a different kind of individualism and I would say a type of insecurity, fear, again, that creates this thing of being able to wreak violence on those who are weaker. Because treatment of the elderly, even it's not necessarily physical violence, it can be emotional violence, it can be material violence. And a lot of that comes, I believe, from a deeper insecurity that enables people to be provoked into strength when they see weakness around them. And of course, elderly are weaker. By definition, you know, as you age, you do lose some of your strength and faculties. And so, yes, that is absolutely true. Very good point. Yeah.
is the only question that we received. There is another question from P.S. Rao. What would be the possible reason for very little and careless love shown by the people in higher up during the pandemic?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because I think it also relates to what you could call the social contract that we have between a people and their government. And again, I think this is regionally differentiated. I think governments in North India can get away with much more than governments in South India, for example. Okay, I mean, I do not believe the government of Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Andhra or Telangana could get away with the kinds of very, very callous approach that was shown in some of the northern states. So there is something to do with the social contract and what governments expect, or rather what citizens expect from their government. Much of what I've said really relates to the big hinterland, if you like, the Hindi heartland and the surrounding areas, which have a long history of, let me put it this way, of a combination of government and ruling class oppression, okay, without very strong social movements to reverse them. In the South, on the other hand, you've had, in some states, very strong social movements, the Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu, many movements in Kerala, emancipatory social movements that have made more citizens aware of their rights and of the obligations of the state to fulfill those rights. So my premise is that governments don't show love because they're by nature loving. Governments show love because they have to, because they're made to, if you like, by the people. And when they're not made to, then it's really very, very rare, fortunate occurrence that you will get a benevolent government. Otherwise, most of the time, they will, support their own particular interests, whatever they may be. So I think it is, in a way, if you look back, it's the absence of those wider social movements that have made people much more conscious of their rights and much more accepting of whatever little they get, which has allowed governments to be so callous, to be so indifferent to the plight of the citizenry. And so here it is. Love is also something which is, it's something that has to be created, yeah, especially among governments. And there hasn't been enough social pressure on governments, certainly on this central government and in many states, to enable them to generate that love.
There is another question from K.C. Shankar Verma. The emergence of the finance capital, especially across cities, have taken away all the love and affection which urban spaces probably would have had earlier. The reverse migration, etc. Could you please throw some comments on it if you like, ma'am? As always, it was wonderful listening to you.
So, yes, finance capital absolutely is part of the much greater power of large capital today, which has distorted social relationships, markets in India. It's massively increased asset inequalities and income inequalities. We are the most rapidly, we are the most rapidly inequalizing country in the world. According to the World Inequality Report, India has the most rapid rate of growth of inequality in the past 2 or 3 decades. So yes, the primacy of finance capital has done many things, including make India much more, the Indian government much more concerned about, or rather show much more love for global investors than for its own people. Okay, so the fact that you're globally integrated, you're worried about your credit rating, you're worried about capital flows going out and all of that, means that you will do everything to suppress your own spending at the cost of your own people and give lots of incentives to large capital, even when that won't give higher investment rates and so on. All that absolutely true. There is a political economy of this, which points to if you like, I mean, I don't want to call it pendulum swings, but that there is a process by which at some point this inequality reaches a kind of, a tension point. It cannot continue beyond that without a destruction of that society, that economy, and so on. So you can either get a reversal or you can get a destruction. It can go either way. I think we're heading towards that point. We have such extreme inequalities now. Mind you, we were always very good at inequality. Yeah, we have caste, for heaven's sake. And then we brought in all kinds of other inequalities. We are one of the worst in terms of gender inequality. We've got class, we've got religion now, we've got all kinds of inequalities. So we are the world experts in inequality. But the kinds of extreme increase in inequality that we have seen in the recent past, those I think are now becoming untenable just for the survival of the social fabric. And so I think we will get a reversal of some kind. And I think that would be aided by what I mentioned in terms of how the young in particular are responding to a lot of these things.
Okay, ma'am. There is another question from Rupa Hari. The culture of fear psychosis is largely exaggerated in ordinary people due to social media. But we have also all seen people coming together, declaring solidarity and mobilizing with the help of social media. So where do we stand as a society in the digital era in the pursuit of erasing fear? What are your thoughts on it?
Oh, wow, this is such a big question. It's a very good question, but it's huge because there's so much going on in social media and it's mostly uncontrolled. And in India, a lot of the manipulation actually comes from the government or from parties close to the government. So it's really hard to control. I don't know how many of you have followed this recent investigation by The Wire, the news website, The Wire. They did an investigation into an app called Tech Fog, which is used by the ruling BJP and a lot of the groups they support, the IT cell and others, which is actively manipulating and setting up using dormant WhatsApp accounts to send all kinds of messages which appear plausible, creating fake websites that look almost the same as the real website, but giving a different impression. So if the New York Times has an article on India that says something bad, they will create a fake New York Times web page that looks almost the same, but has good things about India. And good things, not just about India, but about the ruling government and about the Hindutva agenda and so on and so forth. So the extent to which social media can be manipulated goes beyond even what I had imagined. I mean, I thought you would have to have an army of trolls and so on. Now it turns out you can just do this with an app. You can actually machine do a lot of this terrifying misinformation. And that helps in perpetuating fear and hate and all of these things. How do we confront it? Yes, because all of us use social media also in positive ways. We do that to establish networks, to get our message across, to get solidarity across people, to find out about other things. So we all use social media as well. It's a very complex issue. It's a very tough issue. There's no question that it has to be regulated. But can we trust a government that is actually involved in doing it to regulate it properly? What they're more likely to do is to regulate in a way that will destroy any of the opposition. So it's a very, very complicated issue. I have to confess it's beyond, I don't have simple answers to it, but it is something that we all need to think about very, very seriously.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question from Joy Delhi. Ma'am Ghosh, for every agony faced by this nation, government has no record. No immigrant laborer died. No one died of oxygen scarcity, etc., etc. Now that the government of the land is not taking note, academics and social scientists are bundled up in jail. Civil society is being painted evil. Opposition is being discredited by the media. Ma'am, who will keep the record and fix accountability of this tillage and plunder of large amount of almost a decade?
Yes, this is a very, very tough one. Among the things I could have said about love is that this is a government that doesn't love statistics. It doesn't love any data. It has been systematically destroying the database. And India, we had one of the best statistical systems in the developing world. We had such an interesting and elaborate edifice in terms of how you define labor and employment, in terms of how you collect the data. We really had a very good and reliable statistical system, relatively speaking. All of that has been smashed. Whether it is GDP data, where the change in the base year and the change in what, the instruments you use to measure it has made it really quite unreliable because it's designed to inflate the numbers, or it is the employment data, or it is the consumption survey. They just simply stopped the consumption survey. They refused to publish it because it showed that consumption in rural areas was falling. And so they just threw it away. They burnt it, essentially. And they're not doing another consumption survey. Or, as I mentioned, they don't collect data on migrants because they know it will be bad news. They're now doing a migrant survey, which I'm sure will show that there are lots of happy migrants in different cities doing very well and earning much more than they would in rural areas. And so there is, they did a survey of the Ganga and what had happened to the Ganga after the whole, Namami Ganga action plan and everything. And then they burnt it. Presumably, it didn't show good results. We haven't seen it, but they just ditched it. So this is a government that really dislikes accountability in any form. I mean, the PM cares. When I describe this to my colleagues in the US, they think I'm making it up. No one believes that you can have an opaque fund like this, which has collected money in the name of the prime minister and ministers, and then is saying we're not a public body and we won't tell you what we've done with the money. No one can believe it. So, there are so many areas in which the whole right to information has been completely undermined and destroyed by this government. And of course, right to information is an essential part of democracy. You can't have democracy without it. And that tells us something about where we're going as a nation. What does it mean? I think, as I said a bit earlier, I think there is a sense in which it's a terrible path, and we are definitely on that path, but it's not a path that can be sustained beyond a point. There will be counter reactions, there will be pushback, there will be inevitably a change. It will take a long time to rebuild these statistical systems. It's not going to happen easily because it's much harder to build something than to destroy it. But it will be rebuilt. And we have enough dedicated, committed, hardworking people of integrity who have worked in the statistical system to know how to bring it back and fix it again. But yes, it's an enormous challenge, and we have to recognize that it's going to be a long haul.
Thank you, ma'am. There is a final question from Ms. Vinita, whom you can see on the screen. She'll ask her question.
Yeah, I always think about things that you said, but not in this depth. But I was wondering, quite often I used to wonder if we should address it by the term lovelessness or helplessness, considering the massive population and the minimal infrastructure of medical facilities we have, and the unknown pandemic that made its quick attack. Do you think it is more of helplessness or lovelessness?
I would go with lovelessness. Okay, it's not helplessness. Again, just look at the regional variation during the pandemic. In Kerala, you had lower death rates than anywhere in the world, even though you had the most intensive outbreak of pandemic because of, high travel and all of that. Okay, you have infant mortality and maternal mortality rates that are similar to European countries. And you have other states in the country, I'm not going to name them, you all know which ones they are. Some of them are going to have elections soon, which have the worst. They are worse than sub-Saharan Africa or the least developed countries in terms of basic health infrastructure, so is it that one can afford it and the other can't? No. It is that there isn't a kind of social contract that forces governments to show love for their people, if you like. So yeah, I think it is lovelessness. I think what happens is that faced with lovelessness, citizens feel helpless. So then we think, oh my God, what can we do? And then you're surrounded by instigators of hate. And so you spend all your time battling that instead of battling the real problem. So yes, there are all of those things. But if we can actually surmount those, if we can say, look, we don't have to be this way. There are neighboring countries that are doing a much better job. There are states within our own country that are doing a much better job. And it is possible for us as people to demand much more public health spending, creation of infrastructure, et cetera, make those democratic election issues, which governments cannot afford not to deliver, then we would get a change. So I think it really is, in a way, it's the fact that the social contract has allowed it. So we need to change that in a way. It's not an easy job, I agree with you. But as I said, the thing that inspires me is the protests showed so much creativity and spirit and courage, and so many young people with so many new ideas, that I think they're going to be able to do it. I mean, my generation, we have really left a mess, but I think the younger people are up to that challenge.
And Ms. Ashwati, was that the last question? Shall we call Miss Aishwarya for the vote of thanks?
There is one more question, ma'am. Can we attend that question too? There is one more question.
Yeah.
This is from Elizabeth Sebastian. As the present government has so much love for itself than they have on the people of the nation, how can they inculcate pure love for people within themselves? Also, as India is rich in diversities, is the government showing love, equality to everyone, including people of different religions as well as minorities?
Of course it's not. I think that is absolutely clear. The government at the union government level is not showing equal love to all citizens. In fact, it's showing very little love to any of its citizens except for large capital. But among the others, it is very differentiated across religion, across class, across region and state. If you happen to be ruled by an opposition party, you get very little love from a government, the central government. Across gender, many of its activities and patterns of spending have been very anti-women. So yeah, union government is not showing much love, absolutely. But as I said, they also are able to get away with it. And that's the critical thing, that governments have to be forced by social pressure to show love. So unless we as a society can stop being influenced by the agenda of hate, then we're not going to get governments to show us love. So it's really, we have to be unconvinced by things that say, well, okay, we haven't given you any of your basic needs, but on the other hand, we bash Muslims, so please support us. We can't fall for that anymore. We have to actually be able to call the bluff and say, no, we will not accept this. The social contract has to change.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much. Vinita, ma'am?
Yes, Ashwati. Now, before we go into the vote of thanks, please fill in the feedback form posted in the chat box. And Ms. Aishwarya of St. Teresa's College will now deliver the vote of thanks for this session. Ms. Aishwarya, are you there? Yeah. Ms. Aishwarya PS. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity of proposing this vote of thanks. First and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Ghosh for the wonderful session we had. And we really loved the part where you talked about the collapsing livelihood and unequal distribution of love. And in general, the session was really interesting. And the Q&A section was also really interesting. And next, I thank our chair for the session, Ms. Ashwati MP, for extending out the welcome and chairing the session wonderfully. And a special thanks to Ms. N.K. Vinita for moderating this session. And I would also like to thank Kerala State Higher Education Council, Journal Regularities, Department of Sociology, and St. Teresian International, St. Teresa's College for taking the initiative to organize this session. And last but not the least, I thank the listeners for attending the session and for being a wonderful audience. Thank you all once again.